Have you ever wondered what the Addams Family really are? The Netflix series Wednesday presents us with a whole catalog of supernatural races. Werewolves, mermaids, gorgons, vampires, creatures that are well defined within that universe, and yet the strangest family of all, the Addams, does not fit into any of those categories since their first appearance in Charles Addams' comic strips in 1938. This family has been an enigma. They are not vampires, they are not zombies, they are not witches in the traditional sense, but they possess abilities and oddities that set them apart from any ordinary family. Their powers seem to be inherited from generation to generation, and their connection to the macabre is as natural as breathing. The question then becomes inevitable. What are the Addams? The story of the Addams family begins in 1938 when Charles Addams published his first comic strips in the New Yorker magazine. There was no explanation of their origin or defined special powers. They were simply presented as an aristocratic and eccentric family, fascinated by death, pain, and the macabre, but still deeply united and happy. At this point, the strangeness lay in their tastes, not in any supernatural nature. In the 1960s, the first television series arrived. There, the mystery remained intact. The Addams were portrayed as strange humans, but humans nonetheless. Morticia, with her Gothic elegance, was not a vampire. Gomez was an eccentric gentleman, not a demon, and the children simply had disturbing hobbies. The only things out of the ordinary were details such as Grandma with her potions or the living hand, which became one of the family's most iconic symbols. Later, with the films of the 1990s, the tone changed. Here, glimpses of supernatural abilities began to appear. Fester, for example, resisted explosions and electricity as if they were nothing. Grandma was openly shown to be a witch. Although the film never explained where these abilities came from, for the first time it gave the impression that the Addams were not mere humans, but a lineage with extraordinary characteristics. In the animated adaptations, both in the 1970s and in the more recent ones from 2019, the presence of magic was further reinforced, especially in the case of Grandma and in cartoonish situations. However, the idea that they were vampires, werewolves, or any other recognizable creature from popular mythology was never introduced either. They remained officially the Addams, strange in their own right. Finally, in the Netflix series Wednesday, the Addams universe connects for the first time with a clear system of supernatural races. Mermaids, gorgons, vampires, and werewolves coexist at Nevermore Academy. And there, the Addams stand out because they don't belong to any of these categories. However, we are told that there are hereditary gifts in their lineage, such as the clairvoyance shared by Morticia and Wednesday. This places them halfway between the human and the supernatural, without ever giving them a specific name. Okay, I want to clarify that there is officially no explanation for the supernatural nature of the Addams family, especially if we take into account the original work. But let's play around with the theory a little and try to make sense of the Addams family. Especially with the new Netflix series, the presence of mythological creatures living in that world has become very evident. But not only that, each of them has been adapted in a slightly lighter way compared to the original stories. The gorgons, which are the species of the mythological creature Medusa, were much more hostile, as were the werewolves and mermaids. They are all mythological beings, but they have been romanticized in order to coexist in a kind of society. I mean that they are civilized, unlike in the original mythologies. This is an adaptation of those beings. And if we try to fit the Addams family into mythological creatures, the first thing that surprises us is that there is no exact myth that explains what they are. There's no Addams family as such in folklore. However, we can trace very clear similarities with some ancient legends, especially with the strigoi of Romanian folklore. The strigoi were considered the ancestors of vampires, so much so that they are considered the inspiration for Dracula. It was said that they could be both dead and alive. The dead were corpses returning from the grave, and the alive were people cursed in life. That is what I think fits best with the Addams. The most interesting thing is that, unlike other nocturnal creatures In some stories, the strigoi could return to their homes, live with their families, and even lead a normal life, albeit one laden with an unsettling aura. This family connection is what most resembles the Addams, a clan united in the macabre. In these legends, it was not necessarily a good thing to have a spirit in your house, and in other stories, the strigoi returned to torment their relatives. I think this fits well with the Addams because, although they are very close-knit, each one seems to care only about themselves and they play very cruel jokes on each other. In addition, the strigoi were deeply connected to death, cemeteries, and the night. Exactly the same as the Addams, whose house is almost a mausoleum, full of tombs, dungeons, and funeral decorations. What would be sinister to others is cozy to them. The strigoi moved between the border of the living and the dead. The Addams, although never described as corpses, act as if that boundary did not exist. The crucial difference is that while these beings were seen as dangerous or cursed, the Addams have turned the macabre into something everyday and even endearing. In them, the monstrous does not generate fear, but humor and tenderness. They are, so to speak, the domesticated version of those legendary creatures. Therefore, if we had to give a mythological explanation, the most logical answer is that the Addams are a modern reinterpretation of the strigoi, beings linked to death and darkness, but deeply familiar. Throughout the history of the Addams family, many fans have wondered if theirs is a curse. It's logical to think so. A family that lives surrounded by the macabre, with members who seem half dead or with impossible abilities, would easily fit the idea of a cursed lineage. However, when we review all the versions, from the comic strips to the Netflix series Wednesday, we discover that no official curse is ever mentioned. In fact, that is one point that distinguishes the Addams family from other creatures of folklore. Vampires are usually the result of a curse. Werewolves are cursed by a bite or by the moon. The Addams, on the other hand, carry no tragic explanation. They are that way by nature, not by punishment. Although this theory is very interesting and makes a lot of sense since there is no mention of it in the works, we will move on from this theory. However, if you want a video in which I explain this theory, leave me a comment saying the Addams curse. And if you don't want a curse to fall on you too, I recommend that you subscribe and like this video. If you don't, I'll send a strigoi spirit to your house to torment you, okay? So if we rule out the curse, the comparison that fits best is with the idea of mutants, like the ones we see in modern science fiction. In that context, the Addams would be humans with genetic variations that are passed down through lineage. They are not part of a separate species. They are evolved human beings with abilities that set them apart from the rest. If we draw a parallel with the X-Men, we will understand what it means to be a mutant. Mutants are rejected and renegade beings, but why is Reed Richards, for example, who also has superpowers, not discriminated against? Simply because he is not a mutant, and the conflict between humans and mutants is not a racist conflict as many think, because they are not a race different from humans, but rather an evolutionary problem. Just as we have Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, etc., mutants would be the next evolution of the human species. Drawing this parallel, we can understand that mutants are indeed human. So this explanation would fit with the author's original idea and what would be presented in later productions. At the end of the day, what is clear is that the Addams are humans with supernatural powers, so mutants are basically that. Individuals who do not belong to another race, but represent extreme variations within the human species. It also explains why the entire family shares that strange aura. Theirs is not a possession, nor a spell, nor a divine curse, but a different genetics. That's why they pass it on to their children, and why each generation of Addams maintains the same eccentricity. At the same time, this view reinforces the central idea of the family. They don't see themselves as victims or monsters. They don't suffer their difference as a curse, but celebrate it. While other creatures in folklore bear the burden of their condition, the Addams enjoy theirs. Their identity is not born of suffering, but of pride in being different. In my opinion, the most coherent explanation is that the Addams are not cursed. They are a family of Gothic mutants, humans who, generation after generation, have inherited unusual abilities and characteristics. The Addams Family is, at heart, an enigma that has never needed an explanation. From the comic strips to the Netflix series Wednesday, they have remained an exception. They are not vampires, they are not werewolves, they are not witches in the classic sense. And yet, they possess abilities, gifts, and oddities that make them unlike any other family. If we analyze them from a mythological perspective, the Addams are very similar to the strigoi, beings linked to death who live with their families and move between life and the grave. But unlike them, the Addams do not instill terror, nor are they cursed. If we look at them from the perspective of modern fiction, they fit better as mutants, humans with hereditary variations that make them extraordinary. The Addams are different because that's how they were born, and they celebrate it with pride. That is the key to their appeal. While other monsters suffer from their conditions, the Addams embrace theirs. They do not see their weirdness as something negative, but as an essential part of who they are. Instead of hiding it, they flaunt it. Instead of fearing death, they invite it to dinner. What frightens others is home to them.